Welcome to Perusing's Appraisers on Purpose podcast. Our podcast showcases inspiring appraisers and professionals from the industry who are leaders in their field. How did they get to where they are? What have they learned along the way? What can we learn from them? Your host is real estate investor, entrepreneur, and appraiser, Michael Hobbs.
Well, welcome to another exciting, informative, and engaging episode of Perusing's Appraisers on Purpose podcast. As you know, your generosity and your thoughtfulness, continuing to spread the love in the form of subscribing and liking the individual episodes, continues to bring this to more peers and many more beyond the valuation profession. And today is no doubt another informative and exciting episode. Scott, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. You're very welcome. We appreciate you accepting our invitation. Well, Scott, people want to know, hey, were you born this way, or how did your life come alongside to join the appraisal and valuation profession?
I was not born this way.
Oh, my goodness.
I do think I have a gift for being judgmental, and I like driving around. So that's kind of what an appraiser at least used to do, right? We would drive around and we put things in order. But I graduated from the University of Minnesota before the first spreadsheet was invented.
Wow.
So a business degree without a spreadsheet. Can you believe that? But
I've heard of such things, Scott, but I have to tell you, it's only because I visited the Smithsonian.
Okay, well, so I had my business degree. I did not have an accounting background, so then I was just general business. And we were able to find a job, usually through a recruiter. Remember those?
I do.
Yep.
I do.
And
I still use some now, actually. I totally appreciate it.
I got my first job selling, of all things, plastic netting manufactured by a company here in Minneapolis. And it's used for everything from reinforcing sod when they're growing the grass to keeping birds out of fruit, to wrapping around pallets to keep them from tipping over or spilling. It's built into things like tissue paper to reinforce it. So I wasn't aware at the time, but it was the best job for me I could have imagined, right?
Holy cow. That's amazing. I'm familiar with the netting that you put up to keep birds out. And
yep, that's us.
Familiar with
them.
With the netting that goes on. I'm more familiar putting down straw for holding down the seed once you plant and stuff. But it's interesting about the intricacies of that kind of netting.
Well, I worked there for about 4 years and then ended up in the packaging area. I sold printed packaging for the remaining of that, I would say the 20-year first half of my career.
Wow.
And one of the people that I met along the way told me one day, you would like being an appraiser. He had just become an appraiser. So I followed him along on a job.
Wow.
And I thought, yeah, he's right. This is for me. I was a frustrated architecture student,
Oh, okay.
So I thought this would be kind of fun to do. So I got my training, and then I needed to find a mentor. Of course, that's the same problem everybody else has. But that worked out, and I got my license back in 1999, my trainee license, and then a couple of years later, my certified.
That's impressive.
So,
really
so
impressive.
I've been an appraiser ever since.
That's amazing. So you had spent some serious time in corporate America.
Yes.
Primarily, it sounds like in sales.
Right. Business to business sales. And it was kind of right on the leading edge for a lot of people. The packaging that you see in the store, we would, like a Cheerios box or a pasta box, that's what we would print.
Oh, wow.
And of course, that was their image in the marketplace. It was an important part of their profits.
Yes.
So it got a lot of attention. Got to do some fun things there.
That is such an interesting segment that, of course, is surrounding all of us in so many places. But to stop and think that somebody has to actually account for that relationship and go build more of them.
That's
to sell packaging.
Well, it was fun. My biggest customer made ammunition, and I'm not a gun enthusiast.
Sure.
But one day I had another potential client visiting that wanted to have us do their packaging. And they were so generous at Federal Cartridge, my client, that they asked if we wanted to go down to the shooting range.
Okay.
And it was underground. And they said, pick any gun you want, So, I mean, there was Tommy guns. I picked an Uzi.
Okay.
And I got off about 1 or 2 shots, and then the gun rose straight up because I'm not a shooter.
Oh.
So the kickback just rose the gun up to the top, and I don't know if I hit the ceiling, but I was close.
Oh, my goodness. Oh, my gosh. That is such a great story. So I take it you landed the prospect after you took him over to the client gun room.
As a matter of fact, they were located in Nevada, and they were doing some contract work, and that leads to a couple other stories. But eventually I did find my way into the appraisal field, and I'll never look back. I mean, back then I worked for a boss. I had inventory to get moving. I had to find new clients. I had to explain to them why their prices are going up. And I just am so much more comfortable being more analytical instead of the wine and dine kind of a sales relationship.
That's fantastic to get that exposure and realize that, hey, this just isn't for me.
Not for me. I want to analyze things.
Oh, my goodness. What was it that your acquaintance or your friend either knew about you or experienced around you to say that, hey, I think that there's a better pathway forward for your next segment of your career?
I never asked him that. And I know it was not self-serving on his part. He wasn't looking for a trainee or anything.
Yes.
He just thought it would be interesting, and he loved it. So maybe it was just goodwill on his part to show me around a little bit.
Wow, that's really impressive. I'm thrilled to hear that. And did you start working with him, or was it someone else?
He was gravitating toward the MAI and the things. Yeah. You're an MAI, right?
Yes, sir.
I stuck with residential, and I had a mentor in just a mile or two from my house.
Okay.
That was kind of a friend of a friend. So that's where I got my training, and my goal was to be off on my own as soon as I was certified. And that plan worked out over about a 3-year period.
Oh, good for you. Good for you. And then did you stay in the greater Minneapolis-St. Paul area, or were you more in the outlying surrounding areas, which have quite a different density and topography than being in the city?
Minneapolis is an interesting area because you can say that you cover 5 counties, and it's really not a problem. You can maybe have a 1-hour drive at times.
Yes.
And you could have, these 5-acre properties that required quite a bit of driving. But remember, I'm the guy that likes to drive around and be judgmental, so I didn't mind that a bit.
I love that, Scott. That's fantastic. So when you first started in the appraisal and valuation profession, what was it like for you? You said you got kicked in back around 99.
Right. Well, I was just reflecting on that. The data that we had came in the form of an MLS book. Remember those?
Yeah, I do remember those.
They were published once a week in our case.
Yes.
And you would turn to I think it was by MLS zone.
Yep.
And you'd find the most similar houses, and you'd go frontwards a page if you needed some more expensive comps, and backwards if you needed some less expensive or larger or smaller, right?
Yes.
But the data was not as up to date as it is today. The guy who owned the shop had a copier machine, which was essential.
Yes.
And he had plat maps, which was essential. And he had a typist because he would dictate his reports.
Yes.
And scratch out his adjustment grid on a little piece of paper that he would give to the woman who kind of ran the office, and she would take phone calls. We'd get back from our work, and there'd be a little pile of pink paper for us to return calls.
Yes.
So it was definitely pre-internet. And I remember his son, who was a realtor but in the same office, was trying to explain to me how profound Google was.
Oh, wow.
And I wasn't quite sure if I understood that, but
sure.
But I was there, kind of at the beginning. We had film cameras, obviously.
Yes, sir.
my boss got a kick out of the camera or the film guy would come to his office, right, and drop off the film or the prints from yesterday and pick up the film for tomorrow.
Yes.
So it was kind of the end of the old school.
That is, there's something to be said for having the appreciation of what was available at the time, which was an advancement over previous technology and access to information compared to where things are at today.
Right. And, appraisers were always, I think there was a barrier to entry at the time that doesn't exist as much now.
Yes.
Like Jim had to have an office and he had to have a receptionist, office manager, and he had to have plat maps to be efficient.
Yes.
None of that's true anymore. You can work from home and look up a plat map, bing, bang, boom on your computer.
It definitely changes things. So you mentioned that it took you about 3 years to go through the learning and training process. What type of properties were most stood out for you early on when you got into the profession?
Well, Jim was a ERC and ERC appraiser.
Oh, wow. Say a little more about that. You're the first one to mention that in
right. Well,
several seasons.
It's a relocation appraisal.
Yes.
Or as he called it, a relo.
A relo.
And there was an organization that sold their services to major companies that were transferring people.
Yes.
And Minneapolis has a pretty large group of national companies like 3M and General Mills and at the time Pillsbury, Honeywell, that did relocate their employees. So they had a full service moving system where the relocation company would buy the house and then sell it so the owner could get his equity and go move to the new house. Yeah. So I got trained doing the relocation assignments. And then, of course, really? I didn't have any credentials or standing with those companies. Sure. So I just started doing. The other piece that we did have was drive-by appraisals for a big lender.
Oh, okay.
So that's kind of where I cut my teeth doing the little drive-bys that had the little grid. I think it was the form. Can't remember the name of that form now, but it was
2055.
It was even more primitive than that one, but that was important also. But I should have looked that up.
Oh, that's good. But I mean, you make a good point, especially in cities that have a large concentration of significant employers, that their greatest asset, you argue their brand is very important, but it's really their people. And that ability to attract and retain those individuals is vitally important to their success. And especially the higher up you go, they, much like sports teams, obviously Minnesota has a number of sports teams, with the owner essentially drafting and or acquiring players and players' rights. It's the same thing for a large employer like Target or 3M or even Best Buy, where when they've got somebody and if it's Scott Cullen, they're like, hey, we want you. It's like, doesn't really matter where you live. They're going to put together an employment package that includes not just compensation, but additional benefits. And one is the purchase of, or the guaranteed purchase of your home so that it doesn't restrict you from leaving whatever part of the country you might be in to come there. So that employee relocation service is vitally important because companies don't specialize in that. So they need to outsource that.
Right. And that was back in the days when people were transferred every 2 or 3 years to season them, to become upper management.
Yes.
So they would have one employee move 3 or 4 times generally as their career developed.
80% of all businesses fail within 5 years, according to the U.S. Census Bureau. With so many roles and responsibilities that must be managed and have nothing to do with appraisal reports, is it any surprise that it's hard to keep up? Much less having a sense of peace, stability, and profitability that comes from growing your business? Given all of this, you might already be thinking about exiting your business one day. Don't miss the limited opportunity to work with Michael, a real estate expert and professional coach. He has worked with more than 300 owners and entrepreneurs to find their highest and best use by solving problems that reach their most important goals. Compress decades of learning into days by working with Michael. Michael is famous in real estate and business coaching. With his help, you can accelerate your growth, increase your quality of life, and earn more money, all while ultimately doing less. Michael helps you not just grow your business, but also find new purpose in it. and in your life. If you're ready to take control instead of being controlled, contact him on LinkedIn or email him at michaelh@paru.com.
Yeah, that completely makes sense. Now, because you have experience with the ERC work, you want to share just a little bit about how there's similarities and notable differences from doing a lending assignment?
Well, the advantage of an ERC appraisal is that you saw what it was listed for, right?
Yep.
So that was a good place to start. And then I can still remember Jim when he would take a phone call from a homeowner. And generally, the homeowner was given their choice of 5 or 6 appraisers. And then they would call and interview the appraiser.
Yes.
And I could tell it was an ERC call because as soon as Jim would ask, "Where's the house?" his response was always, "Oh, that's a pretty strong area."
Yep.
So he was a salesman and
Yes.
a very good appraiser, by the way, too. He had won awards from the ERC Council for being the most accurate, at different times.
Yeah. And what does accuracy mean in an ERC assignment?
Well,
Scott?
it's to value the house the closest to what it actually closed for.
Yes. The word that they use in that industry is forecast. So unlike a lending assignment where you're asked to analyze the market activity and conclude to a value at the present day, ERC work actually requests that you forecast a future date and time and state what it's going to sell for. So it's
Right.
in a sense, it's bringing some science to a crystal ball or being a psychic.
Right. Yep.
And it's one of the few areas, there's a couple, but it's one of the few areas that I've found in the valuation profession where you truly get to measure how good you are.
Right.
Because the market does eventually create a transaction in almost all cases. And then you get to measure what your data and what your inferences were against what actually happens.
Exactly. The other advantage of that is that it's not interest rate sensitive.
That's a good
they're
point.
not going to decide not to transfer somebody because the interest rates are too high. That's just the cost of doing business.
Mm-hmm.
So it's good work for people that are looking for some way to specialize.
Oh, that is quite the experience. So you got that great foundation, and then did you stay in primarily residential lending or residential non-lending work as you continued to build out your career?
Yep, it was mostly residential lending back in the day when we had relationships with the loan officer. And fortunately, I was connected with the most honest, trustworthy, trusting loan officer who was pretty successful that I could imagine. I mean, he was critical to my volume of work.
Oh,
and
wow.
I would develop, when things got slow, I'd go out and make sales calls.
Yes.
And you get to this loan officer somewhere that would say, he didn't ask you what was your price. He'd ask you how much you could appraise this one for.
Sounds painfully familiar.
Yes, absolutely. So he's a good friend. He was a real benefit to me. And to find somebody with that integrity in the loan business, you've been around, you've probably seen the other side of that.
Wow. I mean, given your experience, and I'll nod of the hat to your success in business-to-business sales, I would imagine it should have been pretty easy for you to go get clients.
Well, it was when there were clients to be gotten.
Oh,
right?
Say a little more about that.
Yeah, sometimes the rates are not favorable. Like I just read this morning from it was a website of a lender that said, 78% of people would have to have the rates drop below 5% for them to be willing to move. So we've got this situation now where people are kind of rate locked into their homes.
Yes.
The first time buyers are priced out by a combination of the price and the interest rates. And the move up buyers they can't afford the rates as much for the change, and they also can't afford to take a bath on the house that they're selling, right? I mean, if they just went and got the same mortgage they have now, their rates might go from 3 to 6. It might double their house payment.
It's quite an amazing experience, to say the least. And, professionals in the industry have nothing they can do around the economic environment as it relates to interest rate driven transactions.
Right. And that's why I think everybody knows, most people understand that I just got to get out of this AMC treadmill. I've got to find a way to engage directly with people that need to buy an appraisal for some reason. Maybe they're the executor for the first time in their life of an estate, and
Yes.
they need to pull all this stuff together, and the appraisal is something on the checkbox, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the idea is to find that kind of work, and unfortunately, divorce work. I've done some of that.
Yes.
But non-lender work or private work, whatever you want to call it, is everybody's dream. And I've met, through my business now of appraisal software, I've got like 1,000 customers. So I talk to a lot of appraisers.
Yes.
And there are some that saw that coming in 2008, right?
Yes.
Or experienced it in 2008 and decided, you know what, I'm going to get to know agents, not because agents can order an appraisal, but
Yes.
an agent has a network of people that might call them first.
Yes.
If, grandma dies,
Yep.
or if they find out they're getting a divorce or whatever the reason is. So having a network of agents that can send you business is one tactic to help get out of the GSE world.
Yeah, that's a big one indeed. As you look back on your time in and around the real estate profession, obviously, 2.5 decades, a lot of things have changed. But early in the, coming out of Y2K, were you primarily just focused on handling a few local clients, or did you have bigger aspirations back in those early days?
Well, I did this work up until we got disconnected from our loan officers by HVCC,
Yep.
Dodd-Frank.
Yep.
And at that point, I was looking for work, and there were people that were trying to get around that rule. I had one
Yes.
client that was based in Colorado.
Yes.
And the way that they solved it is they said, we've got 50 appraisers on our panel. And whenever we have one in Minneapolis, we give it to Scott. And well, that's because they only had one loan officer in Minneapolis.
Okay.
So I was referred to that company, and that was a direct lender. There was not an AMC involved.
Oh, I see.
But I would work with them, and that ended up being a long and prosperous relationship. The original guy that I talked about, the loan officer, went on to open a branch for another lender that's national that does have an AMC. And
Okay.
with his help, I got approved by them. So I did a lot of work for them too over the last few years.
Yeah, that is quite an experience. Have you always practiced on your own, or did you start to build a team, or how's that gone for you in that first 10 years I should say leading up to the recession at least?
Right. I've never had an employee. I've always been a one-man show.
Yeah.
I could not. I would go bankrupt before I would dare fire somebody. Right.
Yes.
I know I just don't have it to run a tight ship like that with employees. I did train the 4 people that made it to certified residential with that in mind. Like, guys, I'm not going to teach you how to be an appraiser that has to work for me.
Yes.
I'm going to teach you how to open an appraisal business on your own.
That's a wonderful investment and commitment to the profession along the way. How was your experience investing in and training up those 4 individuals?
Well, one of them is the lifelong friend, the first one.
Wonderful.
We started off at a computer shop buying his first computer so he could get going. He had taken his classes. And I don't know if it was the second one. I can't remember what order they came in, but they're all clustered around a short period of time. And he had been an underwriter, again, working for this guy that I knew in the loan industry. And my buddy in the loan industry said, if you want to learn how to appraise, you should see if Scott would mentor you. So he was actually older than me, and he's retired now. Another one I met in the backyard of a house that I was appraising. He came walking over from his house next door.
Yep.
And it was interesting. He's a truck driver. He had worked in construction. And he knew exactly how to measure a house because he had been around construction.
Oh, all right. Well, that would make sense.
Yeah. And I had another trainee who had become an MBA in the Air Force in finance. Robert was a very polished guy.
Yes.
And he could not measure a house. It was just not part of his. And that was back when it was tape measures, right? So I guess don't judge a book by its cover.
Yes.
And the other thing about the Air Force vet, he came to the market at a really bad time when the interest rates were rising and he couldn't find work, so he ended up being an assessor, I think, in Kansas.
Yeah, there's some good things in Kansas.
Yes.
That is definitely the case. So Scott, through that period, you mentioned in 99 and within 10 years, things would completely transform. How was your experience of the great financial crisis, that hopefully once in a generation recession?
Right. Well, I remember in 2004 or 5 and thereabouts, talking with in-laws and so on about, I don't know how people can afford to buy a house.
Yes.
And then we found out how they can afford to buy a house. It's because the people that owned them went under, right?
Yes.
So there was a big drop in the market. My wife works. She had stopped at that for about a 6-year period because we had 2 little babies.
Yes.
And then she was forced back to work, and she loves what she does, so it wasn't a big deal. But
yes.
At one point, maybe after 5 years in, I thought I was the smartest guy in the world. I had all this work, and these trainees. And then not too far later, I realized that this is really due to interest rates. And I think some appraisers are getting their first taste of that right now.
Yes. What does that taste, Scott?
You feel scared. You're really happy to get a job. And I think that's kind of what happened with the AMC model now. The AMCs are kind of in the driver's seat. They've got the customer relationship.
Yes.
And they've always got plenty of people to offer that job to. And the price gets bid down to the lowest cost provider.
Yes.
And I was talking to a friend today. He's in North Carolina. He was paid $400 to do a townhouse, kind of a PUD kind of a thing.
Okay.
And he had to pay $15 to submit, the appraisal. And then there was a mix-up somehow at the AMC, and they sent him a copy of the invoice to the lender. And they had charged $1,200 for that thing. And he was getting $400. So, and I've seen recently that there's been kind of a survey, only like 10 or 12 instances of 3 or 4 AMCs that have been really charging a lot more than they're paying the appraiser to do. And I understand they have the compliance issue, and the banks are afraid of having buybacks, and they want to make sure everything's covered before they lend the money. But I think maybe, I haven't thought about this too much, but maybe the AMCs have raised the value of that non-lender work, right? Maybe the going rate on the street is much higher than what we're being paid. So if we do come across that non-lender work, we shouldn't be shy about asking for more than we are hoping to get for an AMC job.
Holy smokes. As an aside, but in complete support of what you just shared, my wife had decided there was a particular concert this past weekend, and we weren't able to get pre-sale tickets at face value. So we figured we'll wait till day of. And then as in most cases, tickets are priced a lot like options. So for those that invest, have experience of investing in options and long-term options and leaps, that type of thing, the value, depending on the underlying asset, tends to actually increase as you approach termination. But then a lot of times it falls off steeply in the minutes and hours and not necessarily days. So we're like, well, let's see if the prices drop in the tickets. And they were dropping. Right. We bought some tickets. And we were shocked. We got phenomenal seats. So I was grateful for that. I thought we paid a very fair price. I don't know if it was face value or not because they were electronic tickets, but it was probably around what face value would have been. Mm-hmm. But the ticket exchange, without naming one of the 3 or 4 large online ticket exchanges, one that you would definitely recognize the name of, charged $160 fee per ticket.
Right.
And I'm like, you effing didn't do anything. I'm like, Don't get me wrong. You built the platform. I respect. Right. That's amazing. I'm like, but a Visa and MasterCard can charge an egregious, 3% of a transaction. I'm like, I see why people get into this business, in the ticket exchange business. You make $160 and you didn't even own the underlying asset. I was like, this is, I mean, I like somewhere you get 2 times the underlying value. That's a good way to go, Scott. Maybe we should all go out and start an AMC.
I've known actually 2 people I've met that had AMCs back in the day when they were relatively small, and actually 3 when I come to think of it. And I don't think it's not been like this before.
Yes.
Like back when those 3 were in that business, one was in Northern California, one was in Washington.
Sure.
And I'm trying to think where the other one was. Maybe Central California? Or no, Michigan. It was Michigan. And they were not charging egregious fees. Sure. They would provide the marketing service for the appraiser in a sense. Just like any store has a markup. But
and look, I very much recognize I have a number of friends and even associates that have invested in or own appraisal management companies. I think there is a lot of value that they provide in terms of aggregation of resources and helping decrease cycle times. I mean, again, I get it. And there's a lot of risk compliance and so much that goes on behind the scenes that someone out in the field doesn't see. But I have to agree with you that someone having in this case, if you go from 400 to 1,200, depending on how you calculate it, that's
right.
That's 200% above the actual fee.
Yeah.
That one gets interesting, knowing the numbers that I'm much more aware of that most people operate at.
Yes.
Yeah, that's fascinating. But we did not mean to digress as much as we meant to continue the conversation. So you have this experience there, and you survive the Great Recession.
I did. Yeah.
That was impressive. What was your method of skinning the cat to keep food on the table?
My wife has a really good job.
Something to be said about marrying well there, Scott. 2 thumbs up to her. Yeah, well, and to you.
About 8 years ago, my concern was, how do I support my adjustments? I thought the pressure to support adjustments, it's in USPAP, obviously, but the actual lender pressure to do that was going to start sooner than it has. Now it's pretty well understood that appraisers have to support their adjustments.
Yes.
A friend and I started a software company. So that's my way of getting around the issues with interest rates and trying to find business doing appraisals. I just do the ones that come across my desk because of prior relationships for private work.
Yes.
But almost all my income now is helping appraisers support adjustments.
Oh, interesting.
We've got a software as a service model where they subscribe to the website, and there's calculators on there that help them figure out adjustment rates based on depreciated cost and sensitivity analysis.
That is phenomenal. So about middle of the prior decade, as your concern was increasing for how do I actually do the work that I'm supposed to do according to the practices of the profession, you start to consider what ultimately will become a business in the form of answering your question, but also helping others in the process, is what I heard you say.
Right. Yeah. My partner, I give him a lot of credit. He was retired at a young age from the state of Minnesota because he turned 63 and he was done, right?
Good for him.
And he had a background in military intelligence, and he worked for the state. And when he retired, he was in charge of enforcement for both gambling and alcohol licenses. Very smart guy. And he had taught himself how to program and taken classes all the way along. And it is essentially database work. So he asked me one day at church, do you appraisers need any help with like databases and so on?
Wow.
And I wasn't sure if it was a database or not, but I explained to him that appraisers need to do more than rely on their years of experience.
Yes.
I mean, a lot of them, I'm sure, are good-hearted. They want to go out and find paired sales, but there are so few paired sales that it's kind of a joke. So I explained to John that the answer is multiple regression. And John looked at that and he thought, I don't think so. I mean, he's coming at it not as an appraiser, but as somebody who understands how to view relationships of numbers.
Yes.
And that's why multivariable regression gives you some crazy answers every once in a while.
Yes, it does.
It is not a method that you can only use part of. In other words,
Yes.
it's an all or none thing. You can't do multiple regression and say, oh, I like the bathroom adjustment, but this garage adjustment is way off. No. If anybody understands multiple regression at a level that's reviewing your report, they would say, this is not, it doesn't comply with how multiple regression works. It works great for a lot of uses.
Yes.
But not for a sales grid, which is a separate model. Regression is a model. A sales grid is a separate model. So we're imposing the sales grid categories on the multiple regression model, and no wonder we get goofy numbers, right?
Yeah,
so he thought what we should do is use cost as a benchmark, and that was his words. And then I remember this MAI that brought me into the business at first. He had mentioned the term depreciated cost, so I started reading about that. It sounded similar.
Yes.
So that's the direction we went. So now we can support all the adjustments related to cost in the grid, which is the bottom half of the grid. That's a good start.
Sure.
And we support the top 2 rows, concessions and time adjustments. Well, concessions are, that's a different story, but time adjustments we do with group data, which is a recognized method.
Yeah.
And then we use, once we've got all those adjustments made, except for things like view and site size and condition and age, then we can do adjusted pairs.
Yes.
And if we have more than 2 properties, then it's called sensitivity analysis.
Yeah, that's a good way to go.
Handle the grid from top to bottom in a way that people at the higher levels think, hey, that's a great idea. So that's what we've been running with now.
Oh, that's a great way to go as a way to really support people. I think one of the interesting steps that you took that some people might consider, especially with the significant advancement in technology these days, is how did you go from being, in this case, your friend, as you said, benefited from some early retirement from the state of Minnesota. And then, you've been in the profession at this point for a number of years, plus having been in another profession. Most people might be thinking about kind of slowing down, and here you take on something brand new. How does someone, what it sounds like, Scott, and please, if I miss anything, who maybe doesn't have an experience of a startup, go and create a startup with somebody else who sounds like he's never done a startup either?
Right. Well, I think the key thing, and at the time anyway, it might be changing now, but it's very expensive to hire a programmer if you don't know exactly what you want him to do.
Yes.
And because John is a partner, he and I both do our part, and we split the money. So it's I don't have to decide if I want to spend $40,000 to add a feature.
Yes.
In fact, he just added one. Retrospective appraisals are becoming more common, especially for non-lending work.
Yes.
Date of death. So he has now figured a way to select the year of cost data that you want to use right in our program.
Nice.
So you can go back to 2 years ago, last year. I don't think we go back more than that, maybe 3 years, 4 years.
Okay. Oh, that makes good sense. So was it primarily a bootstrap opportunity? And, and you just kept eating John Red Bull and dark coffee? Or how'd you get there? How'd you get from there to where you're at today?
Well, we're an overnight success after 8 years.
Oh, you and Steve Jobs did the same thing.
Right. Yeah. So it is bootstrapped. And early on, we got some exposure with Brian Reynolds on his appraisal report.
Yeah.
And he understood right away. He's a smart guy. He understood right away what we were doing.
Yes.
So he liked it and started talking about it. And then I started teaching classes through Appraiser e-learning, which exposed more people. And I got to know other teachers and other people in the business. And all of a sudden, it was increasing at about 20% a year until COVID hit. Then it took a dip.
Congratulations.
But now it's gone crazy because now we've got that top-down pressure. People are getting reports back. How did you get that garage stall adjustment? Or where did you get the GLA adjustment?
Yep.
So it's very important, I think, for people now, if they want to stay in the GSE side of things, to have a work file and a report that shows that they did the math and how they did it.
Yeah, that is really impressive. So you had mentioned earlier that you really don't do any more appraisal assignments unless it's someone you've worked with in the past or someone reaches out to you. It sounds like you spend most of your time here focused on your SaaS business around depreciated cost.
Yeah, I missed a little bit of that because of my connection here, but I think what you're asking is I still do some appraisal for private purposes, but I'm not out applying to AMCs, right?
Yes.
So I haven't closed the appraisal office part of it, but I think the future for me is the SaaS business because it's growing. This year it's up like 30-40% depending on the month.
Good for you.
So the trick is to make it happen like that for another 2 or 3 years, right?
Yes.
And make the money kind of interesting.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. How big is your team now? I mean, it started out with you and John. Is it still just the two of you and a bunch of black coffee, or you got a whole team now?
John and I handle the appraisal questions, and John keeps the site running.
That is absolutely fantastic. That is fantastic. Is it pretty much you going back out to the gun range and pulling out Uzis, or what's your method of growth these days?
No, it's been, I would say, word of mouth, some advertising in industry publications, going to trade shows, sponsoring like new appraiser events within the trade show.
Yes.
That type of thing.
I love that. Well, I mean, given everything that you've seen and the industries you've been a part of and in your experience and obviously working with John, what are you looking forward to or optimistic about over the next 3 to 5 years, Scott?
Well, I think the industry is in change. It's in a state of change right now. Appraisers need to adapt and retrain themselves, to become what the future is going to require. I think the GSC work is going to continue to be very, I would say, marginal work for an appraiser. They're not going to make a lot of money doing GSC work.
Yeah,
I don't think. Maybe some people have got it figured out. They've got 4 trainees doing it, and they're just reviewing the work. I don't know, but it's definitely changing. And at this trade show that I was at, the speaker had a slide up on the screen of a Blockbuster store. and on the sign it said everything must go, right? Blockbuster was it. It was great. You didn't have to go to the movie. You could watch it at home. Yeah. They even sold you the popcorn and the candy. Mm. And then they were displaced by Netflix, which was mailing you the disc right to your house, your new Blu-ray disc. Yeah.
Yes.
And then it was the red box. You could pick them up near the grocery store. Yes. And now it's all streaming. Netflix was able to make the change.
Yeah. They cannibalized the product.
Yeah, well, they realized they weren't in the business of renting media.
Yes.
They were in the business of delivering content. Yes. So I think appraisers have to be a little bit more like Netflix and less like Blockbuster.
That's a really good point. That's a really good point. Fantastic. Well, Scott, it is always insightful to hear from peers, especially ones that are doing something revolutionary or transformative. And in this case, unexpected. I don't know that you ever considered that you were going to be an owner of a SaaS business when you grew up.
Not at all. If anything, I thought it'd be a little desktop widget that would do some appraiser math more quickly. But
oh my gosh. Oh, that is so good. That is so good. Well, Scott, we really appreciate it. I want to thank you again for joining us for Perusings, the Appraisers on Purpose podcast.
Well, it's great to be here, and I would encourage somebody that might have an appraiser who has a brother that's a programmer to jump in, right?
Yeah.
There's a pretty famous duo out there in appraisal world, Spark. That's an appraiser brother and a tech brother that decided to make something big, and they're just going gangbusters.
No, it's absolutely fantastic. So great to see that, and I fully expect there's going to be so much more technological evolution as well as innovation in the coming years with the access to large amounts of data that people need to sort out and understand. And they need professionals who can do that.
Right. And the other big thing that's happening right now is the change away from the 1004, the static form.
Yes, sir.
There are the people that are in the forms business that are trying to roll out or will be rolling out their I guess you'd call it not a billboard, a dashboard approach.
Yes.
I've seen one of them that's done a remarkable job in the early stages, but I've also heard other people that are not in the forms, never were in the forms business, are going to be jumping in because of their expertise.
Oh, yeah.
In a different area of appraisal. So it's going to be the Wild West for the next couple of years, I'm pretty sure.
I would agree with you. Wild West is a good way to describe it. Kind of you and I remembering back to the good old days when you went from Blu-ray to Betamax and ultimately VHS, just sorting out the formats.
That's right.
And it's not clear at the outset which one's going to win until the dust settles.
That's exactly right.
That is definitely the case. Well, Scott, thank you again. I really appreciate you joining us here for this episode.
All right. Thank you, Michael.
You're welcome. And friends, again, thanks for spending a little bit of time with us here on this lovely day. We hope that you got not only some inspiration, but also some education on greater opportunities around what's going on in the industry, as well as for the industry, and possibly even something that you could do to help advance the industry. So with that, we'll bring this to a close. Make sure to populate the comments. Scott's an avid one on social media. I mean, if you didn't know better, he is. I think you can find him on TikTok even. But all jokes aside, we appreciate Scott joining us today. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Parusing's Appraisers on Purpose. We hope you enjoyed learning from the amazing professional paths and achievements of our beloved guests. Before we go, please subscribe on your listening channel, Spotify, LinkedIn, YouTube, and other podcast channels to hear more from appraisers and valuers regarding their life and their work. After you drop a comment below, who is one friend and peer you can generously share this episode with? If you have any suggestions or questions for future episodes, we'd love to hear from you. Just send us a message on LinkedIn and we'll be sure to get back to you. Thanks again for listening, and until we're together again for the next session of Parusing's Appraisers on Purpose, create the change that you seek.